I'm Roxy, and I'm the owner of Valkyrie Fitness. And today we're going to learn how to do a deadlift without weights. Now I have my kettlebell here so I can show you what we're working towards, but I know a lot of people, they want to figure things out before they get into the gym, before they get into the fitness studio, so they don't feel like they're left behind by the time they get there. So this will give you a way to start learning that hinge pattern so that when it comes time for you to join a gym, join a studio, you feel like you already know what you're doing. So first things first, let's talk about the difference between a hip dominant movement and a knee dominant movement, right? So a squat is a knee dominant movement. We start by unlocking the knees. A deadlift is a hip dominant movement when we start by breaking at the hips, okay? And there's a lot of different hinge movements out there, but we're gonna start with learning a traditional kettlebell deadlift. So the first thing, the easiest way to learn that hinge is on the ground. So we call these kneeling squats, which is kind of a confusing thing, but bear with me. We're gonna start by tucking our toes under. And again, we're gonna practice breaking at the hips to send my hips to my heels. And then I'm gonna stand up, squeeze my glutes. Push my hips back, bring my hips forward. So very little movement happening below the knees, right? Just in a regular deadlift, our shins more or less don't move. It is our hips that do most of the moving. Now this also teaches you about how important it is to keep your glutes squeezed at the top and to keep your spine nice and long, because we don't want to be doing a deadlift with a rounded spine. Okay, so start by practicing these. If you can, practice in front of a mirror or film yourself so you can look at your spine. Are you going like this or are you going like this? Practicing sitting the hips back. So the next level from this would be a good morning. So a good morning is kind of like a standing version of that. So we're gonna have our heels under our hips. We're gonna focus on squeezing those glutes at the top. We're gonna keep our spine nice and long. We're gonna put our hands behind our head. Now, why do we do this? So we can engage our upper back. When a lot of people do these, I see a lot of rounding through the spine, right? I see a lot of people who end up looking like this. Now, when we put our hands behind our head, you see your elbows if you're rounding your spine. If you're keeping your back active and your elbows wide, that'll help you know you're keeping a long spine. So look out the peripheral vision. Do you see your elbows? If the answer is no, you're probably doing a really good job of keeping your spine nice and straight. If the answer is yes, you can see your elbows, your back is probably rounded. You see how my back is rounded here? So really focus on keeping those elbows out wide when you're practicing your good mornings, okay? Now let's add on a few more cues for that. I want you to think of inhaling as you go down, exhaling as you come up. I want you to think about how the hamstrings stretch here and how they contract here. So it is about a lengthening and a contraction. Now, with good mornings, our legs stay pretty straight. I say unlock the knees, so don't lock them out, especially with hypermobility. Keep your knees unlocked, but they're straight-ish, okay? And then another cue, in addition to keep your back flat, is try to keep your torso centered over your feet, okay? So notice how I'm not leaning forward, right? I'm keeping my feet evenly grounded. I'm trying to keep my torso centered over my feet. That means I have to push back my butt to do so. And then one other thing that I want to talk about, and this gets really important as we move on to weighted deadlifts, is we don't want our shoulders to go below our hips. Okay, now I have like pretty good hamstring flexibility, right? It's easy for me to reach the floor. I do a lot of mobility training, but when it comes to weighted exercises, for most people, unless you have a really strong low back and you're working on strengthening your low back more, we want to keep shoulders at or above hips. So here's why. When our hips are lower than our shoulders, our hips, our glutes are the fulcrum. They become the main mover, okay? So my glutes are the main mover to help me switch directions, okay? Now, if I let my shoulders go below my hips, now my low back is the fulcrum, okay? So now I'm lifting up from my low back. You see that with my arm? I'm lifting from my low back now, whereas once I get here, I'm lifting from my glutes. Do you see that difference? I think when a lot of people strain their low back when doing deadlifts, that's a really big part of the reason, is that they're letting their hips go, their shoulders go too low, and now it's the low back that's doing the lifting instead of the glutes. Biggest muscles in the body, some of the littlest. We don't want to be lifting heavy weight with these. Okay. And just while I'm talking about that, that is also why it's important to keep your torso centered over your feet. Okay? Because as you can maybe see, if I'm keeping my knees locked out and I'm like reaching forward with my torso, what's becoming the fulcrum? It's the low back, right? Whereas if you push those hips back, can you see how this is now the fulcrum again? That's the point at which everything pivots around. So that, we've covered our kneeling hinge, we've covered our standing hinge. Now let's talk about what that would look like with the weight, okay? So let's talk about the difference between a good morning and a deadlift, okay? A good morning, again, is mostly straight legs, right? You can say similar to a Romanian deadlift, except with a good morning we usually hold the weight up high, and in a Romanian deadlift we usually hold the weight down low. We're holding an imaginary weight by putting our hands behind our head. Okay, so I'm keeping my legs mostly straight. I'm really just hinging at the hips. There's very little knee movement, okay? Now, when it comes to deadlifts, there's gonna be a little bit more knee movement. So I'll show you a side view and then I'll turn around to the front. But we wanna think of our hands, because we're gonna pretend we're holding a kettlebell here, as traveling up and down an elevator. So I'm gonna push my hips back, reach for the ground, and then I'm going to stand back up, okay? So in order to keep my hips below my shoulders, in order to keep my hands close to my body, I have to allow more knee bend, okay? So I need to have more knee bend so my butt can go back farther so I can keep my torso centered over my feet, okay? Because remember, we want our weight centered over our feet. So in order to keep our weight centered over our feet, we have to send our booty back. Again, if I'm holding my kettlebell, my shoulders should be straight in line with my kettlebell. So here's what that would look like if I didn't let my knees bend, okay? I would either have to lock out my knees a whole bunch, like this, right? So if my knees are locked out too much. But now, do you see that my shoulders are in front of my hands? We don't want that. And the kettlebell must always land behind your toe line. So if I lock out my knees, now I can risk training my knees, but do you see again what the problem is? The low back's getting too involved, right? And so maybe you try to center yourself by reaching forward. So I can't bend my knees, so I reach forward more. Do you see where the problem is? I'm gonna be straining my low back. So if I want my hands to end up behind my toe line, and by hands I mean weight, then the way I keep myself centered over my feet, by pushing my butt back, okay? So if, again, you struggle with that rounded spine. Practice setting up like this. Squeeze your buns and hold. Now practice getting a little lower and a little higher. A little lower, a little higher. Maybe you grab some water bottles for some light weights and you work on figuring out how to turn on the glutes in that movement. So now there's one other thing I want to talk about in regards to stance, and I'm going to do this facing forward this time, and that is how wide your legs should be. So how wide your legs should be depends on what kind of deadlift you're doing, okay? So for today, I'm talking about a conventional kettlebell deadlift, all right? So in a barbell deadlift, your feet tend to be a little bit more narrow. In a kettlebell deadlift, I'd say more shoulder width, which is wider than hip width, right? And then toes can be turned out slightly. Another way I like to think about this is when I go down and my arms are straight, because I want my shoulders straight over my hands, my knees need to be wider than my elbows here, right? If I was too narrow, I'd be squished, and then I end up being tilted forward, which again could strain the low back. So I have to have my legs wide enough that my elbows can fit in between so I can have that tall posture, okay? So notice, even though the angle of my knees is decreasing, I'm not really moving my knees that much, right? I am pushing my butt back, and only at the end are my knees moving a little bit, okay? And that's just to help me get low enough to reach the kettlebell. So it's a hip movement first, a little bit of knee bend at the end, okay? So now I'm going to show you with the actual kettlebell. So in your mind, you can put it all together. But again, if you don't have a weight, you can still practice all of those body weight exercises I just talked about. So let's do it from the side first. I'm going to straddle my bell. That's what I call it when I make sure the bell is behind my toe line, okay? Some people say it should be right at the ankle line. If you're doing a barbell deadlift, it would trace your shins the whole way up and down. I want to make sure it's my stance is shoulder width apart. My toes are turned out slightly. Sure I won't bonk my head on the pillar. Okay, I'm going to push my butt back. I'm going to reach for my kettlebell. Notice how I don't want to be like this. I'm going to lean back, put my weight more on my heels, pre-squeeze my glutes. This, by the way, is work. Just holding this position is work. I'm going to inhale here. I'm going to exhale, stand up. Inhale down. Exhale up. Notice how my back stays straight. My hips stay below my shoulders. I'm going to do one more. Now I'm going to turn to face you and do a few more so you can see what it looks like from the front. Okay, so I'm going to give you one more body weight exercise. And not everyone will need to do this one. It's kind of a bonus exercise. It can be helpful if you find that you just can't send your butt backwards. You keep leaning forwards instead of backwards, okay? So what can be helpful then is to start up against a wall and take maybe half a step forward, and then practice those exercises we did, right? So how can you measure? Remember how we practiced this stance, putting our hands in our knees? At the bottom of your position, you should be able to touch that wall, okay? So that's how we know our butt can go back far enough. Now we're going to stand up, and we're going to practice just that hinge, just the top half of the hinge, and your goal is to try to touch the wall with your butt. Inhale down, exhale up. Okay, and then if you want to step it up a notch and you want to start learning single leg deadlifts, you can do a similar thing, but put your foot on the wall. Maybe a little bit more centered. It's easier with a bigger wall than it is with a little pillar. Okay, and again, work on pushing the butt back and forward. And that'll help you learn how to do out a single leg deadlift, having something to press into. Okay, and there are so many more cues in regards to how to learn to deadlift, because again, there's so many more stances, so many things you can combine it with, but that should get you started. So just to summarize, we have our kneeling hinge, we have our standing hinge, good morning option to help you with that back strength. We can practice just standing here, squeeze the bun, hold. Maybe you practice sliding your hands up and down your shins, so you can practice those vertical shins. And then of course you can practice the whole thing. And you can grab whatever you have around the house. It can be a gallon of water, like a gallon of water. It can be anything heavy. I've done it with my corgi before. We can use a sandbag. My corgi is very sandbag shaped. You can use it with whatever you want, okay? And let me know if you have any questions. If you want me to do more like this, also, just let me know. Have a good day.